Everybody stop what you're doing and take a moment to internalize what you are looking at, because the impossible has just been done. Super Mario 64 is now on the PlayStation. Kinda. Around the end of November, I stumbled by complete chance onto an ongoing project to take Super Mario 64 and get it to run on a PlayStation. The project, to my understanding, is based on the successful decompilation project that was completed a few years ago, and it's... well, it's a work in progress, but still very fascinating and more than a little impressive when you actually know a little bit about what it was like developing games for these systems. In its current state, it's not a game that you can play all the way through. You don't start with a file, instead you have the debug level selection screen, and when you get a star, the game freezes, so it's not beatable. But it is technically playable by some definition. The controls are surprisingly far along, and it has DualShock support right out of the gate, meaning that both analog control and the rumble features are available. I played this game on the DuckStation emulator, and I've heard conflicting reports about its ability to run on actual hardware, but so far, I'm just kind of impressed that Mario 64 is on the PlayStation in any form whatsoever. The graphics and sound engine are not finished, but you can still tell what everything is supposed to be. Judging from PlayStation's existing library, I think this could absolutely become a viable conversion one day, albeit with a few necessary tweaks and sacrifices. And that's one of the things that makes this project so compelling. You can't really talk about it without also discussing the hardware differences between the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation, because this game demonstrates a number of ways in which they differ. I wouldn't call myself an expert in these matters, but I have read a lot about this over the years, so if any of you actually are experts, feel free to explain what I got wrong, but just for fun, here's an oversimplified explanation about what's going on here. Now, the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation were kinda designed to do very different things. That might sound unintuitive and strange considering they're both 3D capable video game consoles, but the ways in which they go about producing 3D graphics and the results of that are quite different, to the point that games on either console have their own distinct look, their own tells. To the untrained eye, it might seem slight, the difference between these two crusty old games that both look extremely dated by modern standards, but when you've been around as much as I have, you can immediately tell which game was the product of which hardware. Today, video game hardware tends to be relatively standardized. Even though the process of developing a game for the Switch 2, PS5, and Xbox Series X isn't exactly the same, a lot of the components are very similar. Both the PlayStation and Xbox GPUs are AMD RDNA 2 based, and their CPUs are both 8-core Zen 2 CPUs, and even though they're not an exact match for horsepower, they're developed by the same company, and at least I imagine, a lot of the development know-how is kinda transferable. If you compare a game that released both on PS5 and Series X, a lot of the time you won't see a dramatic difference in terms of visuals. Most people probably need Digital Foundry to even be aware that there are any differences. This was not the case in the 90s though. 3D graphics technology for video games was uncharted territory. The hardware was often so custom built, so proprietary, that the development environments would be completely different. You couldn't just write a game engine for the Nintendo 64 and put it on PlayStation and change a couple settings and expect it to work. Even the Sega Saturn's GPU didn't render triangles, instead using quadrilaterals. That's how unevolved the technology was. They couldn't even agree on what polygons to use. Everyone was experimenting, and it wasn't always immediately clear which experiments were yielding the best results. They had to learn how to build the technology and then how to actually use it at the same time. So right off the bat, PlayStation uses CDs, which have much slower access speed than cartridges while holding a lot more data, but that much is obvious to everybody. A more complex issue would be textures. Now, textures in PlayStation games were often highly pixelated, which might be off-putting to some people, while textures on the N64 games were often smeared and blurry, which some will argue is way worse. The Nintendo 64 has a texture filter to smooth out the pixels, which ideally makes them more seamless, but can also harm what little detail the already low-resolution textures could produce. The N64 also had anti-aliasing capabilities, which was a new feature at the time, but instead of making the games look smoother like it's supposed to, it often instead made it look blurrier, which isn't very nice to look at. So N64 games often looked worse, counterintuitively, because they used forward-looking hardware features. Then there's texture warping. On PlayStation, textured polygons often do this weird thing where they'll stretch and warp and wobble around unnaturally, and sometimes to mitigate this issue, level geometry will subdivide itself into a more dense polygon mesh when you get close to it. Since the warping tends to get worse as the polygon surface areas get larger, chopping it into smaller polygons could mitigate this issue to an extent, but was also more resource intense since the hardware now has to do the math on more polygons, and this is an area where the N64 actually has a leg up. Textured polygons on the Nintendo 64 had no such warping issues. The technology behind the N64 was developed by SGI, a now defunct company that developed a lot of graphics tech, and the same company responsible for the workstations on which the graphics for Donkey Kong Country were made. Because of their experience, they were able to implement a huge array of forward-looking features directly into the hardware. And while anti-aliasing didn't always stick the landing, a far more important feature was its ability to display perspective-correct textures, allowing the system to draw these super wide, sprawling environments with relatively little geometry being spent on it. You can walk all the way across Hyrule Field and the grass textures won't do shit. Keep in mind, all of this is, again, the oversimplified SparkNotes version, but once you start to gain a cursory understanding of the matter, you begin to understand why this PlayStation port of Super Mario 64 is both very impressive and very fascinating, because it put a lot of these differences on full display. Now, to reiterate what I said earlier, I imagine an experienced developer could absolutely make a version of Mario 64 for the PlayStation that is an entirely legitimate way to play, given enough time. The game that you're seeing here is once again a work in progress that is being made out of passion and scientific curiosity. At some point down the line, it may well become an entirely playable and legitimate version of the game. One of the most interesting things about this game is the sound effects. Throughout the game, you'll hear all kinds of noises that sound strange and unlike anything you hear in the actual game. At least, that's what I thought. But in retrospect, I suspect that the sounds I'm hearing actually are in the original game and they are supposed to be playing, except in the original game's sound engine, they would be modified, pitched up or down, and hit with some kind of real-time audio processing effects. And everything I'm hearing is just the raw, unfiltered sounds. This is to say that these sounds originally sounded the way they do in this version before the audio system cooks them up into something way better. I don't know if that's actually what's happening, but Kaza put out a really good video back in October about Mario 64's sound engine that I think everyone should check out, and if I understood the video the way that I think I did, that's what I believe to be happening.
This means stuff like the camera sound and the coin sounds share an instrument, even though personally I absolutely cannot hear the similarity between those two sounds. Here's what the unremixed sound sounds like if you're curious.
This whole video is full of interesting discoveries, like the fact that Charles Martinet's voice samples for Mario were often chopped up and remixed into different sounds for the other characters using real-time audio processing, meaning that he technically voiced way more characters than probably even he realized. If any of that sounds insane to you, then you should definitely check out this video. And anybody interested in this demake should definitely check it out as well. It's a very interesting piece of work and a great springboard for super technical discussions in your nerd circles at the Magic the Gathering tourneys, or whatever it is you nerds are about these days. I have no idea because I'm not a nerd, I am a stud who talks about Earthbound ROM hacks. In any case, it'll be a nostalgia trip, almost as big of a nostalgia trip as tomorrow's video. And with all that being said, Merry Christmas, cousins!